Everyone, this is Dan Cohen with Behind the Headlines, continuing the coverage of the ongoing assault on the Gaza Strip. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Haidar Eid, Associate Professor of Cultural Studies at al-Aqsa University and a BDS activist. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for hosting me.
So first, can you tell me, we're now, I believe, 10 days into this Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip. What has been your experience so far? Tell us where you're based, where in Gaza are you, if you're comfortable with that, and what has this been like for you?
Well, again, thank you, Dan, for hosting me. I live in Gaza City itself. I live in Rimal, and I'm also, as you said, an associate professor of culture at al-Aqsa University, which is based in Gaza, Rimal, and also in Khan Yunis in the south. I have witnessed the four massacres: 2009, 2012, 2014. I also joined the Great March of Return, and I saw all the crimes committed by apartheid Israel in Gaza. And now today is the 11th day of the current bloodbath. The truth, Dan, is that apartheid Israel, and Israel is an apartheid state. We need to make that clear right from the beginning. I'm saying this not because Human Rights Watch has said it, not because B'Tselem, one of the mainstream Israeli human rights organizations, said it, not because Isqua said it, but because I have my own personal experience in South Africa. I got my PhD degree from South Africa. I spent about 6 to 7 years also in Johannesburg. So I know what apartheid is. And this is why every single time I mention Israel, I have to qualify that with, apartheid Israel. And so when apartheid Israel decided to start and launch another murderous campaign of bombardment on Gaza, and Gaza, for those who don't know, is one of the most densely populated areas on earth. We are talking about 2 million people living on 360 square kilometers. And, every single time Israel does this, the victims all the time are children, women, doctors, medical specialists, academics, students, etc., etc. So this is the experience that we have been going through lately. And today is the 11th day is this bloodbath.
And you said you live in Al Ramal area, which is kind of the city center of Gaza, and is not only it's important culturally. It's kind of where people go for a stroll in the street and this sort of thing. And one of the things that's remarkable to me is that this is one of the places that's been very severely targeted by Israeli bombing so far. I mean, how has that been? Just before we started recording, we started hearing more shelling. I mean, that's obviously terrifying experience. How has that been on a personal level for you?
Yeah, on a personal level, as I told you before we started recording, Dan, I have 2 kids, 4 years old and 3 years old, and with my wife, and for them, of course, this is a shocking experience, and we have to deal with that. We have to comfort them, because Israel usually, when they want to attack, they decide to attack around 12 or 1 a.m. And it takes them about 2, 3, 4 hours, attacking with American-made F-16 and F-16 fighter jets. Over the last, 10 years, Israel has bombed and flattened several apartment blocks around, in the area where I live right now, in Rimal, as you said yourself, including, 6, towers, high-rise buildings. We're talking about, 12-story buildings, 13, 14-story building. Those residential buildings most of the residential buildings that Israel decided to attack are based, are in the Rimal area. Al-Yarmouk Street, which is not far from where I'm living, Al-Jala Street, where Al Jazeera, for example, Al Jazeera offices and AP, Associated Press offices, are based. And all those buildings are in the middle of Gaza City, which is in the middle of the Gaza Strip. I mean, you are familiar with Gaza yourself. 2 nights ago, for example, apartheid Israel implemented, I'm sure your listeners and your audience know very well, must have heard of the Dahya doctrine. The Israelis decided to implement the so-called Dahya doctrine.
You should explain that. Explain that, Dr. Eid. Yeah. Not many people know what that is.
Okay. Which is a blueprint for massacre, which states that every Gazan, no matter how old he or she is a legitimate military target, whether you are 1 year old or you're 100 years old. And they developed that doctrine at Tel Aviv University, by the way, one of the Israeli generals, before 2006, before attacking Beirut. And it's called Dahya, means in Arabic, Dahya is the southern neighborhood. And that is the southern neighborhood of Beirut, where the Lebanese resistance movement has its popular support and popular base. And they decided to attack civilians and civilian areas in order to force the resistance movement to surrender. And this is what they have done in Gaza as well. In 2009, they did that. They attacked Gaza for 22 days, starting in on the 27th of December, for 22 days, killing 1,200 civilians in order to force the resistance movement. And when I say the resistance movement, I need to be very clear about it. I'm talking about all political factions here in Gaza, from right-wing organizations to left-wing organizations, from Hamas and Fatah to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So it's not only Hamas, as Western media likes to portray it. So they attacked Gaza in 2009, using and implementing the Dahya doctrine, killing, wiping out entire families, in 2008, and then in 2012, again for a week, killing more than 200 people, again wiping out entire families. And if that was not enough, they decided to do the same thing again, 2014 and 2014 for 51 days, killing more than 2,400 people. More than half of those who got killed were children then, and in this current onslaught, also more than half of those who got killed are also children. We're talking about 63 children and 39 women. And notice, so we are talking about 4 massacres over the last decade, or about 12 years. And before that, Israel had decided to impose a deadly medieval siege. My friend and comrade Ilan Pappé, the famous Israeli historian, he called it incremental genocide, the deadly siege that Israel decided to impose in Gaza after the election of Hamas, after Hamas had won the elections of the Legislative Council in 2006, and they wanted to punish us, to punish the people of Gaza, and they decided to impose this deadly siege in order to force us to rebel against the Hamas movement. I myself am secular, by the way. I never supported the religious organization, etc. But people voted for Hamas not because people love Hamas. It's because people wanted to punish the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah organization for the so-called peace process, which had failed, the so-called two-state solution, which is a racist solution par excellence, and for the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And the only alternative people saw at the time, January 2006, was Hamas. It was the most organized political force on the ground that could pose challenge to the corruption of the authority at the time. And this is why, supported by the United States of America, supported by a hypocritical, spineless European Union, and supported by reactionary Arab regimes, Israel decided to impose, this deadly siege, which is still going on, by the way, until, this moment. And as if that was not enough, Israel decided to launch those massive genocidal, I would really call them genocidal onslaughts on Gaza.
When I was in Gaza for the final 10 days of the 51-day assault in 2014, on the final night, after the ceasefire was already agreed upon and it was imminent, this is when Israel decided to start bombing the major towers, the al-Aqsa tower, the Italian compound. And I thought to myself at the time, this is clearly a message that, for one thing, Israel's inflicting maximum damage possible on the civilian population that has no actual, military value, these buildings, and is not only targeting, the poorer areas that had already been destroyed, Shajaiya, the border areas, but the kind of professional, more well-to-do classes closer to the center of Gaza. And I thought to myself, when the attack resumes, it's basically an inevitability that this is where it will pick up, with taking out towers. 7 years later, I have been sadly proven correct. So why do you think that Israel has targeted these towers? I mean, as you said, they targeted the Al-Jalaa tower is a perfect example, which is, I actually lived in that tower for about 3 months. This is the building where Al Jazeera and AP broadcasts out of. So why is Israel targeting these towers? What is the message they're trying to send?
Right. Two things, Dan. I mean, the first thing, let me take you back to the Dahya doctrine. I mean, this latest Dahya doctrine invasion, as you said, in the most populated neighborhood in Gaza, Rimal, and of course started on the 15th of May, and resulted in the destruction, not only towers. I mean, we're talking about villas, we're talking about tens of houses, shops on, the Wahda Street, completely destroyed. The Wahda Street is completely destroyed now. Shops, streets, and that has resulted in the deaths of, as I told you, about 240 people, I think, today. By the way, still there are some bodies that are being retrieved from under the rubble. In addition to that, I need also to remind you, that of the Shifa Hospital. I know the story with the Shifa Hospital it's overwhelmed after more than 15 years of the blockade, over a year of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, and the horribly injured victims of the latest massive onslaughts. So that's number one. Number two, I mean, there is a context for what is happening right now. We are dealing, Dan, and I think this is the problem with so many intellectuals. And I think this was the problem with some Black South African intellectuals, that they didn't really understand what apartheid was all about. And I think with some of our intellectuals also, we don't really understand what Zionism is all about. Our problem is with an ideology of settler colonialism and apartheid that denies the existence of the indigenous and native population. I mean, let me just, take you back to what one of the Israeli generals had to say, Moshe Ya'alon. Moshe Ya'alon once, he said, we want the Palestinians to understand, that was after 1967, to understand in the deepest recesses of their consciousness that they are a defeated people. Moshe Dayan said, look, Palestinians have to understand that we will use, we will act like a mad dog, that they have to deal with us as if they were dealing with mad dogs. I mean, there is no rationality, there is no reason, and we will attack and kill and kill and kill. The advisor to Ariel Sharon, the Israeli late prime minister, he said, look, we want Palestinians, that was in 2006, we want to count the calories that we will allow the Palestinians to use in the Gaza Strip. That is all based on an ideology that denies your existence, that dehumanizes you first. And then it becomes very, very easy for them, to kill you. And this is why, Israel, as you know, Dan, is controlled right now, completely controlled by right-wing fascist right-wing parties nowadays. And I'm sorry, there's, because I have two
This is
kids,
the bombing.
I can't hear, yeah. An F-16 is flying. Because, yeah. Sorry, so this is what is happening right now. They want to send a very, very strong message that don't ever think of resisting our occupation. Look, the nation state law. Israel is the state of Jews. Okay, wherever they are born, whether you are born in Alaska, whether you are born in India or in Russia, you have the right to Israeli citizenship upon your arrival at Ben Gurion Airport. I was born in Palestine. My parents and my great-grandparents were born in Palestine. We are not, or we don't have that. We don't have that right. And therefore, Israel. What I want to say is that Israel is an apartheid state that privileges, Israeli Jews at the expense of the right of the indigenous population. And this is exactly what happened in South Africa. This is what happened in the American South as well. And I think it is important for people to understand that Israel is also, Desmond Tutu visited us. Archbishop Desmond Tutu visited us. Comrade Ronnie Kasrils, one of the senior leaders of the SACP, South African Communist Party, ANC, African National Congress, and he visited us, in Gaza. And you know what they told us? Most of the anti-apartheid activists, when they visited Gaza, they told us this is far, far worse than what we had to go through, during the heydays of apartheid. And they were talking about, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The Sharpeville massacre took place in 1960. I myself called what is happening right now in Gaza, Palestinian Sharpeville. But, looking at the flip side of the equation now, the Sharpeville massacre, at the time led, or rather gave a momentum to the BDS call against the apartheid system. And this is what is happening right now for us here in Palestine. In 2005, and I'm not sure whether you want me to talk about that or not. But,
yeah, please. I was going to ask you about that. I mean, I know you're a member of PACB, which so if you can talk about BDS, and I mean, I think it's important to understand this attack, this massive attack on Gaza, in a kind of regional context. So what do you think are some of the regional implications? Because now, it's not only happening in Gaza. There's an uprising across Palestine, across 1948, inside Israel, so-called Israeli cities in Jerusalem, and also there's people in Lebanon and Jordan going to the borders, and even Palestinians in Jordan who were, ethnically cleansed from the West Bank and from 1948 Palestine, who successfully crossed the border into the occupied West Bank. So, what do you see the implications regionally, and what does this mean for the BDS movement?
Right. Okay. And again, I mean, we need to deal with definitions here. I mean, let's agree that apartheid is a colonizing power, and it is based on deep-rooted racism. So what? In a way, it's settler colonialism. The problem that we have is that the official Western world acts as if there were two equal parties. Now, you and I know that there were no two equal parties in South Africa: the colonizer and the colonized, the oppressor and the oppressed. And for that reason, a handful of ANC activists had a meeting in the late 50s, 1958, 1959, in London. And they decided to call on the international community to intervene on the side of the oppressed by boycotting the apartheid system, divesting from it, and from companies benefiting from its from its oppression of the Black South Africans, and imposing sanctions on it until it complied with international law. The point at the time, Dan, is that the ANC activists did not expect Western government to heed that call. And this is why they decided to address international civil society. We've learned that lesson. We've learned that lesson. And this is why after the Durban conference, the 2001 the anti-racism, the 2001 anti-racism conference taking place in Durban, in which the NGO forum, not the government's forum, issued a fantastic statement, actually, calling a spade, calling Israel a racist settler colonial state. We took that and decided, when I say we, I mean, Palestinian civil society, and decided first to issue our academic and cultural boycott for one reason, is that we believe that first, we need to decolonize the Palestinian mind after years of occupation, and after about 20 years of the 10 years of the signing of the Oslo Accords, which recognized Israel's right to exist on 78% of the historic land of Palestine, and then ended accepting a racist solution, which in a way reduced the Palestinian people to only those who live in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And this is why, when we decided to issue our call, we decided to make it, a rights-based call rather than political call. We wanted the international community to boycott Israel, divest from it, and from companies benefiting from its occupation of Palestine, until it complies with international law. Notice, international law, that's what we called for. And that was the trick, to make it a rights-based movement. First, we want Israel to withdraw its troops from the Arab land it occupied back in 1967, including Eastern Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, of course, including Eastern Jerusalem. Two, we want Israel to implement United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for the right of all Palestinian refugees to return to the towns and villages from which they were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and compensation, of course. Number three, and this is the trick, Israel is an apartheid state. It has basic laws. More than 60 of those basic laws define it as an apartheid state. And you know that apartheid is a crime against humanity, according to international. So we want the international community to treat Israel the same way it treated the apartheid system of South Africa. And it is working. It is working because you know that Israel is considering now the BDS movement a strategic and sometimes an existential threat. So we have reached, I think, our South African moment now. We have reached our South African moment by together with popular resistance on the ground, in Gaza with the Great March of Return, with the anti-apartheid wall, movements in the West Bank, with the Sheikh Jarrah, with what is happening right now in Lud, Yafa, Haifa, Israel, Palestinian towns and cities. In other words, we, not only the BDS movement, as part of Palestinian civil and popular resistance, but we have managed, I call it de-Osloization of the Palestinian mind. Decolonize and de-Osloize the Palestinian mind by redefining the Palestinian cause as a cause against apartheid and settler colonialism and occupation. And this is why I believe in the one-state solution, a secular, democratic state for all inhabitants of the historic land of Palestine. I hope I have managed to answer your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's treated, this vision is treated as radical in Western media, but it seems that if the West supports democracy as it claims, then this just seems like actually the moderate position, equal rights for everyone, and in an actual democracy.
Yeah.
What do you see the role of of the governments that have normalized with Israel, in particular, the United Arab Emirates? Saudi Arabia has not officially normalized under Donald Trump's so-called Abraham Accords, but we know that the Gulf regimes, the Gulf monarchies, Morocco also normalized. Turkey has close relationships with Israel, as much as Erdogan pretends to be a supporter of the Palestinian cause. What do you see the role of these governments in particular in the current situation in Palestine?
Listen, if you have diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel, and if you are an Arab, and if you're an Arab government that has decided to normalize ties with apartheid Israel, you are complicit. You are complicit in the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed, by apartheid Israel. But again, we don't count on those, normalizing governments. What we bank on is, people. People. We know that Emirati people, 88% of the Emiratis are opposed to the Abraham Accords. The majority of Saudis are opposed to the Abraham Accords, and this is why we think, not only Arabs. I think, internationally, I think, it is the ethical responsibility of every single person who believes in freedom for all to make sure that, what is happening to us will never happen again. And look, when it comes to the Arab world, we are not calling for solidarity. We have partnership. We have partnership with with Arab brothers and sisters. The same thing applies to South Africa. Look, I personally have never believed, even before the signing of the Abraham Accords, and Sudan, Morocco, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, even the Egyptian governments. I have never believed in the possibility of those governments seriously giving support to the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation and return of refugees. I mean, I have never believed in that. And I think we were very clear in the BDS movement, led by the BNC, the Boycott National Committee. And we issued very, very clear statements as soon as the Abraham Accords were signed, calling on all Arab civil society organizations in the Arab world to oppose those those agreements, and that is what happened. We got the support of almost all. There's almost an overwhelming consensus then in the Arab world that Israel is a settler colonial state that must be boycotted. You saw the support we got, you talked about, the support we got from Jordan. 2/3 of Jordanians are originally Palestinians. Most of Palestinian refugees live in miserable conditions in refugee camps in Lebanon. So I think we do not have a problem with Arab peoples, 22 Arab countries, but rather with some of those governments. And I think this is why now the BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions against Israel is the responsibility not only again, of civil society organizations, but every single individual, whether in the Arab world or internationally speaking. The same way apartheid in South Africa was treated, we are expecting the same treatment here in Palestine. This is what we can all do. We can boycott Israeli goods. We can boycott Israeli institutions. We can divest from Israel. and demand sanctions. Only then will Israel start to reconsider what it has done to the Palestinians of Gaza. Israel has been literally done war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, how many dead bodies of Palestinian children does the world need to see in order to start acting? To hold Israel accountable for those war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think in order to reach that stage, that South African moment I'm talking about, we need the support, of every single, individual in the world, not only in the Arab world. And this is why, as I told you, in 2005, more than 170 civil society organizations in Palestine issued, what has become very famously called, the BDS call, calling on the international community to boycott apartheid Israel. Not only the Arab world, but of course, with the Arab world, we expect more.
Can you explain? Well, I see some supporters of Palestine who only understand the issue as an issue of as one of human rights, which clearly, obviously, it is an issue of human rights. But to me, it's also even more of an issue of imperialism, and that can't be separated from the U.S. empire at large, the entire region, of course, whether it's the U.S. destruction of Syria, whether it's the Sisi coup regime that was put in Egypt that the U.S. has supported, whether it's the U.S. support for the Kingdom of Jordan. I could go on, but I mean, can you explain how Palestine is an issue of imperialism and not merely an issue of human rights?
I'm glad you're asking this question, because the argument I've been having with comrades here and, in South Africa and the West is that, the importance of Gaza, of course, within the context of what you are talking about. I think, Gaza and what happened in Sheikh Jarrah could spark and initiate a different, a new Middle East. Different in terms of, what, if you remember, the U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice described back in 2006. She said, after the destruction of Iraq, within the imperialist worldview of the Middle East, of course, in particular, she called it a new Middle East. And I think, what is happening right now in Gaza and in Palestine could spark and initiate a new Middle East. Condoleezza Rice's imperialist worldview saw, that new Middle East as something characterized by American and Israeli hegemony. That was the imperialist worldview of the new Middle East. But what I'm saying is that the current, and I would call it uprising, that is taking place right now in Palestine, we call it intifada. The current intifada uprising, I think it could be the birth pangs, a new beginning of a new Middle East characterized by the end of American imperialism in the Middle East. And this is why all those reactionary Arab regimes, exactly, excuse me, like the governments of the infamous Bantustans of South Africa, that didn't want to see the end of the apartheid system, because that would automatically mean the end of the Bantustans, the infamous Bantustans of South Africa. The same thing applies to this, a new Middle East that was envisaged by Condoleezza Rice. And this is why those, reactionary Arab governments have very close ties with apartheid, the apartheid regime, which, supports the imperialist worldview in the Middle East. But at the same time, you would also notice then that all those governments follow the American solution to the so-called conflict in the Middle East. And it's not a conflict, by the way, because if you say conflict, you are talking about two equal parties. We do not have two equal parties here. We have one colonizing power supported by imperialism, supported by the United States of America, having almost the fourth or the fifth strongest army in the world, equipped with F-16, Merkava tanks, etc., etc. And on the other hand, what do you have? I mean, we have absolutely nothing. But this imperial power in the Middle East, representing the United States of America and other imperial powers, is also supported by other reactionary Arab regimes. And I said exactly like, the governments of the Bantustans of South Africa. And the end of apartheid Israel would automatically mean the end of those reactionary Arab regimes. So no wonder then that you have those strategic ties between the government of Egypt, between the government of the United Arab Emirates, the government of Morocco, etc., etc. And no wonder then that all those governments support the racist two-state solution. All right. And the alternative, the anti-imperial alternative that, we are offering. And when I say we, I'm not only talking about, radical intellectuals, I'm talking about even liberal, your ordinary liberal intellectuals who believe in liberal democracy, equal rights, one person, one vote. The solution offered by Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. So what we believe in is, as opposed to the racist two-state solution, is the establishment of a secular democratic state on the historic land of Palestine, an inclusive state like, South Africa. And this is our anti-imperialist approach to the Palestinian question.
One of the things that seems really different to me as this time as an outside observer of this Israeli assault on Gaza is that they're they're targeting all over the place, but there seems to be a special emphasis on destroying the kind of more middle and upper class echelon of Gaza, which many people don't know even exists, but there are class divisions in Gaza. And while there's already widespread poverty, it seems like an attempt to make everyone destitute and to inflict the most psychological damage for people who thought that maybe the center of Gaza City was there's no safety. There's no safety in Gaza. It doesn't exist. But comparatively to the border regions, that tend to suffer the brunt when there is an Israeli assault. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. As you said yourself, Dan, there's no safe place in Gaza. It's we know that. But I also, I forgot to say, and I'm sure you know this. 2/3 of Gazans are refugees. Who were ethnically cleansed in 1948. But yeah, you're right. We didn't expect them to start, by attacking Rimal. We didn't expect them to do that. They, as I said to you, they destroyed Al-Wahda Street, for example, and the Wahda Street massacre that took place 2 days ago.
Explain what is Al-Wahda Street so people know the significance of it.
Yeah. And this is part of the Rimal neighborhood. Where you have the middle and upper middle class people, living. Two of the people who were, and as I told you, entire families were wiped out. And when I say entire families, especially in Rimal, we're talking about middle and upper middle class, people, including, for example, medical specialists like such as Dr. Ayman Abu al-Auf. And I was shocked when I heard the name, Dr. Ayman Abu al-Auf, a specialist. He's the specialist and the head of the internal medicine department at the Shifa Hospital. And he's the coronavirus patient file officer as well. And there is another doctor whose name has escaped me. He's a neurologist, a very famous neurologist. Both of them were killed, and they, their bodies were retrieved from, beneath the rubble. So why is
along with, I should say, their entire large, and not only, when you think of living with your family, in the United States with your immediate family, but with multiple generations and aunts and uncles, some, dozens of people. So, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Extended families here. I mean, in Gaza, yes, we have a nuclear family, such as just as myself, I live with my wife and my kid, but we also have that thing, we live, extended families. And that's what happened. And that night, they attacked five buildings. They brought them, down to the ground, and that is the place where people like Dr. Abul Auf and the other neurologists. So why is Israel doing that? I think, as I said, Israel wants to send, a very, very strong message to the Palestinian people in general, like what it did back in 1981, 1982, when it attacked Lebanon. Committed the Sabra and Shatila massacres with right-wing fascists, Lebanese fascists at the time, sending a very strong message. Look, Deir Yassin was the beginning in 1948. All settler colonialisms are based on, either genocide, where you are based right now, in the Americas, not just America, etc., Australia, in New Zealand, Native Americans, Aboriginals, Maoris, etc., or apartheid and ethnic cleansing. They couldn't carry out, genocide in 1948. The euphemism that was used at the time, still being used, is ethnic cleansing. And that's what happened in 1948. And what is happening right now is an ongoing Nakba. Nakba is, the Arabic word for catastrophe, for those people who don't know. So this is what is happening. And this is why in 1948, they targeted the same thing, influential middle class neighborhoods in Jaffa, Haifa, urban areas. And they wanted to do the same thing in Gaza this time. And this is why when they started with, and still going on, by the way. I mean, I can hear chilling here. I'm still going on. They started with Al-Rimal. They claim that this is the base of, the resistance movement in Gaza. The resistance movement. Usually, when Khaspara is the propaganda tool used by the Israeli media, the Israeli Foreign Affairs Ministry, etc., etc. They say, this is the base for Hamas. And in fact, the resistance movement in Gaza consists of, yes, Hamas is part of it, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front, including, some factions within, Fatah itself. And yes, many of the members of those factions are based in Rimal. The leaders of those factions are based on Rimal, but the cadres and other leaders are also based in Rafah and Khan Yunis. And by the way, last night they attacked Rafah and Khan Yunis, not only Rimal, Rafah and Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah. Today they were Jabalia and Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. So they started with Rimal because they wanted to start with a very, very strong message. The safest place that you think that you can hide in is not that safe any longer. And I can tell you, look, people are resilient here. People are defiant. Palestinians and Gazans, Gazans that. And even my kids, 4 years and 3 years old, when they they hear a rocket, they hear an F-16, they say, well, they tell me, well, we are not afraid, even though they are afraid, but they know that we can, look, we do not have an alternative. We do not have a choice. The only choice we have is to resist. And I think, so the message is, look, even the most influential areas here in Gaza are not safe.
Dr. Haidar Eid, thank you so much for your time, and especially during this, horrifying attack where we can hear Israeli F-16s dropping missiles around you and shelling going on. So just want to really deeply, deeply thank you. An honor to interview you right now.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you.